The quiet streets of the small neighborhood were alive with the sounds of birds chirping and children playing in the distance. It was one of those rare mornings where the sun shone just right, painting the sidewalks in warm golden light. An elderly man, stooped with age but full of quiet dignity, made his way down the pavement. He moved slowly, leaning on his worn wooden cane, which had been his trusted companion for years. His every step was deliberate, a silent testament to a life lived with resilience and perseverance. He nodded politely to the few neighbors he passed, offering a warm smile to anyone who glanced his way. His presence was one of calm, a gentle soul who had seen more than his fair share of hardship yet carried himself with a kind of grace that demanded quiet respect. But not everyone saw it that way. A police cruiser pulled up at the corner, its siren quiet, but the lights flashing briefly as it stopped. The officer behind the wheel looked out at the elderly man, narrowing his eyes. There was nothing threatening about the old man, nothing at all. But for reasons that didn't need to be spoken, the officer's expression hardened. "Hey! You!" The sharp voice cut through the morning air like a blade. The elderly man turned slowly, confusion flickering in his tired eyes. He didn't respond right away, unsure if the officer was speaking to him. But the officer stepped out of the cruiser, slamming the door behind him, and began walking toward him with purpose. "Yes, officer? Is something wrong?" the old man asked, his voice polite but carrying the tremble of someone caught off guard. The officer didn't answer right away. Instead, his eyes darted to the cane, then back to the man's face. "What are you doing out here?" the officer demanded, his tone sharp and accusatory. "Just taking a walk," the man replied, still holding on to his composure. "It's a nice morning, and I like to stretch my legs." The officer stepped closer, his hand resting on the belt where his baton was clipped. He towered over the elderly man, his posture aggressive, his eyes cold. "That cane," he said suddenly. "Where'd you get it?" The old man blinked, startled by the question. "This? It's my cane. I've had it for years," he said, lifting it slightly for the officer to see. "You sure about that?" the officer said, his voice dripping with suspicion. "You don't look like someone who'd own something like that." "Looks stolen to me." The accusation hung in the air, heavy and cruel. The elderly man's heart sank. He'd heard this kind of tone before, seen this kind of hostility. It wasn't about the cane. It never was. "Officer," he said carefully, trying to keep his voice steady, "I assure you this is mine. It was a gift from my late wife. Please, there's no need for this." But the officer wasn't listening. Instead, he took a step closer, his eyes narrowing as if trying to find some excuse, any excuse to escalate the situation. "Let me see it," he barked. The man hesitated, his grip tightening on the cane. It wasn't just a walking aid, it was a memory, a piece of his past, something deeply personal. But he didn't want trouble. Slowly, he held it out for the officer to inspect. The officer snatched it from his hand, turning it over as if expecting to find something incriminating. When he didn't, his frustration seemed to grow. "What's this made of?" "Looks expensive," he muttered, more to himself than to the man. "It's just wood," the elderly man said softly. "Please, can I have it back?" But the officer wasn't done. "You carrying anything else? Drugs? Weapons?" he asked suddenly, his voice growing louder. The man's eyes widened in shock. "No, sir. Of course not. I'm just an old man trying to enjoy my morning." The officer's face twisted into a sneer. "We'll see about that. Turn around," he ordered, his hand now resting on his baton. The elderly man froze, disbelief washing over him. "Turn around?" he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why? I haven't done anything wrong." "Don't make me ask again," the officer snapped, stepping closer, his tone menacing. Fear gripped the old man. But he did as he was told, turning slowly, his hands trembling as they rose slightly. He could feel the officer's presence behind him, looming, oppressive. What happened next was so fast, so unexpected, that the man barely had time to react. The officer grabbed him roughly, forcing him against the wall of a nearby building. Pain shot through his frail body as his cheek pressed against the cold brick. "Stop resisting!" the officer shouted, though the man hadn't moved an inch. "I'm not resisting," he managed to say, his voice cracking with a mix of fear and pain. "Please, I have done nothing wrong." But the officer didn't stop. With one hand pinning the old man against the wall, he used the other to yank the cane roughly from where he had tucked it under his arm. The elderly man gasped, his body weak, unable to fight back. The sound of the cane hitting the pavement echoed loudly as the officer threw it aside. "People like you think you can just walk around, acting like you own the place," the officer muttered under his breath, loud enough for the man to hear. Tears pricked the old man's eyes, not just from the pain but from the humiliation, the sheer unfairness of it all. He thought about his wife, about how proud she'd been of the life they built together, the values they'd upheld. She wouldn't have wanted him to be treated like this. The confrontation caught the attention of a small group of onlookers who had gathered at a distance. Murmurs spread through the crowd as they watched the scene unfold. Some pulled out their phones, recording the interaction, their faces a mix of disbelief and anger. "Hey! Leave him alone!" someone shouted from the crowd. The officer turned his head sharply, his expression darkening. "Stay back!" he barked, his hand moving toward his baton. But the crowd didn't back down. More voices joined in, demanding that the officer stop. The tension in the air was thick, heavy with the weight of injustice. The elderly man, still pinned against the wall, turned his head slightly to see the faces of those who were standing up for him. For the first time since the confrontation began, a glimmer of hope sparked in his chest. The officer, realizing the growing number of eyes on him, hesitated. His grip on the man loosened slightly, but his expression remained defiant. He wasn't used to being questioned, especially not by a crowd. Then, something happened that no one expected. From the back of the crowd, a young boy stepped forward, holding something in his hands. It was a small, folded piece of paper. The boy couldn't have been more than 10 years old, but his eyes were filled with determination. "Sir," the boy said, his voice loud enough to carry over the murmurs of the crowd. "That man is my grandfather. He didn't do anything wrong." The officer froze, his eyes flicking to the boy and then back to the elderly man. For a moment, the air was still, the tension palpable. The crowd watched, waiting to see what would happen next. The elderly man looked at the boy, his heart swelling with emotion. He wanted to reach out, to comfort him, but he couldn't move. The boy held up the paper, his hands shaking slightly. "This is a picture of him and my grandma. She gave him that cane. It's his. You can't take it away." The officer stared at the boy, his face unreadable. The crowd, emboldened by the boy's bravery, began to chant. "Let him go! Let him go!" The situation had reached a boiling point, and everyone could feel it. Something was about to change, but no one knew what would come next. And then, just as the officer opened his mouth to respond, another voice cut through the air, a voice full of authority and control. "Enough!" All eyes turned to the source of the voice, and the crowd parted slightly to reveal another figure stepping forward. The officer's face paled, and the elderly man's breath caught in his chest. Whoever this person was, they were about to change everything. The voice came from a man who emerged from the crowd, his presence commanding but calm. He wore a suit that hinted at authority, not flashy but clean and professional. His stride was steady, and his eyes held a sharpness that seemed to cut straight through the chaos of the scene. The officer stiffened immediately, the tension in his body clear to everyone watching. The elderly man turned his head slightly, straining to see the source of the voice. His heart was still pounding from the confrontation, and though he didn't recognize the man, something about him seemed to shift the atmosphere. The crowd fell silent, waiting for what would happen next. "Officer," the man said, his tone measured but firm. "Step back." The officer's jaw tightened. "Sir," this man step back. The man's voice dropped slightly, the authority behind it leaving no room for argument. The officer hesitated, then reluctantly released his grip on the elderly man. The old man staggered slightly, catching himself on the wall before the young boy rushed to his side, wrapping his small arms around his grandfather protectively. The man in the suit turned his attention to the elderly man, his expression softening. "Are you all right, sir?" he asked gently. The old man nodded, though his hands were still trembling. "I think so," he said quietly, his voice strained. The crowd murmured, their attention shifting between the officer and the man in the suit. The tension in the air was thick, but the presence of this new figure seemed to calm it slightly, like a dam holding back a flood. The man straightened and turned back to the officer, his demeanor once again sharp and unyielding. "What's your name and badge number?" he asked. The officer bristled. "I don't see why that's relevant," he said, his tone defensive. "It's relevant because I just witnessed you assault an elderly man without cause," the man said, his voice steady but carrying an edge of steel. "Now your name and badge number." The officer hesitated, glancing at the growing crowd and the phones still recording. He muttered his name and badge number under his breath, but the man in the suit wasn't satisfied. "Louder," he said. "For everyone to hear." The officer glared but repeated the information, his voice tight with anger. The man in the suit nodded, pulling out his phone and typing something quickly before looking back up. "Stay where you are," he said firmly. "This isn't over." The officer's face darkened, but he didn't argue. The man turned back to the elderly man and his grandson, his expression softening once more. "Do you need medical attention, sir?" The old man shook his head. "No, thank you," he said quietly. "I'm just a little shaken up." The boy, still clutching his grandfather's side, looked up at the man in the suit. "Thank you for helping us," he said, his voice small but sincere. The man smiled, kneeling down to meet the boy's eyes. "You were brave to speak up," he said. "Your grandfather is lucky to have you." The boy nodded, his grip tightening on his grandfather's arm. The man straightened again, glancing at the crowd. "If anyone has footage of what just happened, please save it," he said loudly. "This needs to be handled properly." Several people in the crowd nodded, holding up their phones. The officer shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting around as if searching for a way out. The elderly man, still leaning against the wall, took a deep breath and looked at the man in the suit. "I don't even know your name," he said. The man extended a hand, his grip firm but gentle. "My name is irrelevant for now," he said with a small smile. "What matters is making sure justice is served." The old man nodded, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and weariness. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him, but he also felt a glimmer of hope. The man in the suit turned back to the officer, his expression hardening once more. "I suggest you call your superior," he said. "You've got some explaining to do." The officer clenched his jaw but didn't respond. Instead, he reached for his radio, muttering something into it. The crowd began to disperse slightly, though many people stayed, their curiosity and outrage keeping them rooted in place. As they waited, the elderly man leaned down to pick up his cane, his movements slow and deliberate. The boy helped him, his small hands steadying the cane as he handed it back to his grandfather. "Thank you, son," the old man said, his voice thick with emotion. The boy nodded, his expression serious. "I won't let anyone take it away from you again," he said firmly. The man in the suit overheard and smiled faintly. "You've got a good grandson," he said to the old man. The elderly man nodded, his eyes glistening. "He's my pride and joy," he said quietly. Before anyone could say more, another police car pulled up, and a higher-ranking officer stepped out. His uniform was crisp, and his demeanor was calm but authoritative. He surveyed the scene quickly, his eyes lingering on the elderly man and the man in the suit before turning to the officer who had started the whole confrontation. "What's going on here?" the superior officer asked, his tone measured. The man in the suit stepped forward before the first officer could respond. "What's going on is an abuse of power," he said. "This man," he gestured to the elderly man, "was harassed and assaulted for no reason other than walking down the street with a cane." The superior officer's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of concern crossing his face. He looked at the elderly man, his posture softening. "Sir, is that true?" The old man hesitated, glancing at the officer who had confronted him. He could still feel the sting of humiliation, the ache in his back from being shoved against the wall. "Yes," he said finally, his voice quiet but firm. "That's true." The superior officer sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose before turning to the first officer. "We'll discuss this later," he said sharply. The man in the suit stepped forward again. "Discussing it isn't enough," he said. "There are witnesses, video evidence. This needs to be addressed immediately." The superior officer frowned but nodded. "I'll take the statements myself," he said. "Sir," he added, turning to the elderly man, "if you're willing, I'd like to hear your account of what happened." The old man hesitated, but the man in the suit gave him an encouraging nod. "Go ahead," he said softly. "You deserve to be heard." The elderly man took a deep breath and began to speak, his voice trembling slightly but growing stronger as he recounted the events. The crowd listened in silence, their earlier murmurs replaced by a solemn stillness. As the old man finished his story, the superior officer's expression darkened. He turned to the first officer, his tone sharp. "You're relieved of duty pending an investigation," he said. The officer's face twisted in anger, but he didn't argue. Instead, he stormed back to his cruiser, slamming the door before driving off. The crowd began to cheer quietly, their relief palpable. But the man in the suit didn't look satisfied. He turned to the superior officer. "Relieving him of duty isn't enough," he said. "What happened here is part of a much larger problem, and it can't be ignored." The superior officer nodded slowly. "I understand," he said. "We'll handle it appropriately." The man in the suit didn't look convinced, but he didn't push further. Instead, he turned back to the elderly man and his grandson. "Are you sure you're all right?" he asked again. The old man nodded, though his eyes were still filled with emotion. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't stepped in." The man in the suit smiled faintly. "You don't need to thank me," he said. "You deserve to walk down the street without fear." As the crowd began to disperse further, the boy tugged on his grandfather's sleeve. "Can we go home now?" he asked softly. The old man nodded, patting the boy's shoulder gently. "Yes, let's go home." The man in the suit watched them go, his expression thoughtful. He knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of something much bigger. And he wasn't about to walk away from it. As the elderly man and his grandson walked away, the crowd slowly began to thin, but the tension in the air lingered like an invisible weight, pressing down on everyone. The man in the suit stayed behind, his sharp eyes following the officer's superior as he spoke quietly with other officers who had just arrived. Whatever promises had been made about handling the situation didn't sit right with him. There was something about the way the superior officer carried himself, calm but evasive, like someone who had perfected the art of keeping things quiet. The man in the suit took a deep breath, his hands clenching briefly into fists before relaxing. He had seen scenes like this play out before, far too many times. Justice delayed, diluted, or swept under the rug entirely. This wasn't just about one incident, it was about a system that made moments like this possible. He couldn't walk away knowing there was a chance this officer could avoid accountability. The old man's story stayed with him. The cane, the aggression, the boy's frightened voice, it all burned in his mind. He couldn't stop thinking about how vulnerable the elderly man and his grandson had been in that moment. If no one had stepped in, how far would it have gone? That thought made his stomach turn. He glanced at the small group of people still lingering near the scene. A young woman with a phone in her hand caught his eye and gave him a determined nod. She hadn't stopped recording since the incident began. Another man nearby was talking quietly with someone, pointing toward the police cars and shaking his head angrily. It was clear that people weren't going to forget what had happened, but whether that was enough to make a difference, well, that was another matter entirely. The man in the suit walked over to the young woman with the phone. "Do you still have the footage?" he asked. She nodded. "Every second of it," she said. "I'm uploading it now, just in case." "Good," he replied. "Make sure it's safe. They'll do whatever they can to bury this." Her eyes widened slightly, but she nodded again, her fingers moving quickly over her screen. "I'll send it to every platform I can think of," she said. He gave her a small, approving nod. "Smart. But be careful. They might come after you if they find out you're behind it." The woman's expression hardened. "Let them try," she said. "People need to see what really happened here." As he walked back toward his car, he noticed a black SUV pulling up a short distance away. Two men in plain clothes stepped out, their movements deliberate and purposeful. They scanned the scene quickly, their eyes locking onto the superior officer. The man in the suit paused, watching closely as they exchanged quiet words. Something about their body language set him on edge. He moved closer, staying just out of earshot but keeping his attention fixed on the group. The superior officer glanced around nervously, his gaze landing briefly on the man in the suit before looking away. One of the plainclothes men handed him a folded piece of paper, and the superior officer's face tightened as he read it. The man in the suit knew that look. It was the expression of someone who had just been given instructions they didn't like but had no choice but to follow. Whatever was on that paper, it wasn't good. Before he could get closer, the two men in the SUV turned and walked back to their vehicle, leaving as quickly as they had arrived. The superior officer stuffed the paper into his pocket and walked briskly back toward the police cars. The man in the suit's instincts were screaming at him now. Something was happening behind the scenes, and it wasn't going to end well if he didn't act fast. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through his contacts until he found the number he needed. "It's me," he said when the call connected. "I need a favor. Can you meet me?" The voice on the other end asked a few quick questions, and the man explained the situation as concisely as possible. By the time he ended the call, he was already heading toward his car, his mind racing. Meanwhile, the elderly man and his grandson had reached their small home on the edge of the neighborhood. The boy was unusually quiet, his normally cheerful demeanor replaced by a heavy silence. The old man noticed but didn't press him, knowing the day's events had shaken him deeply. As the boy sat at the kitchen table, staring at his untouched glass of milk, the old man placed a hand on his shoulder. "You were very brave today," he said softly. The boy looked up, his eyes filled with worry. "Why did that man hate you so much, Grandpa?" he asked, his voice trembling. The old man sighed, his heart breaking at the question. "Sometimes people hate what they don't understand," he said gently. "It's not right, and it's not fair, but that's the way the world can be." "Will he come back?" the boy asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The old man hesitated, not wanting to lie. "I don't know," he admitted. "But no matter what happens, we'll face it together. You're not alone, and I'm not alone either. There are good people out there who will stand up for what's right." The boy nodded slowly, though the worry didn't leave his eyes. The old man patted his shoulder again before sitting down across from him. They didn't say much after that, but the silence between them was filled with an unspoken bond, a quiet strength they both drew from each other. Back at the scene, the man in the suit met with his contact, a journalist with a reputation for digging up the truth no matter how deeply it was buried. The journalist listened intently as the man recounted everything that had happened, from the initial confrontation to the mysterious arrival of the plainclothes men. "This is big," the journalist said, his eyes narrowing. "If what you're saying is true, there's more going on here than just one bad cop. This could go all the way up the chain." "That's what I'm afraid of," the man in the suit replied. "I need you to get ahead of it. The video footage, the witness accounts, everything needs to be out there before they have a chance to spin the story." The journalist nodded, already scribbling notes. "I'll start making calls," he said. "But you need to be careful. If they know you're pushing this, they won't hesitate to come after you." "I can handle it," the man said, though he wasn't entirely sure he believed it himself. As the journalist drove off to begin his work, the man in the suit stood alone in the fading light, his mind racing. He knew time was running out. Whatever was happening behind closed doors, it wasn't going to stay hidden for long. The elderly man, meanwhile, sat in his living room, staring out the window as the sun dipped below the horizon. He couldn't shake the feeling that the day's events were far from over. His grandson had finally fallen asleep on the couch, clutching a worn stuffed animal, but the old man's thoughts were too restless to let him find peace. Suddenly, the sound of tires crunching on gravel pulled him from his thoughts. His heart jumped as he peered out the window, seeing the faint outline of a car parked just down the street. The headlights were off, but the silhouette of a figure inside was just barely visible. The old man's pulse quickened. Was it paranoia, or was someone really watching him? He moved quietly through the house, checking the locks on every door and window. The boy stirred on the couch but didn't wake, and the old man was careful not to make too much noise. As the night deepened, the car remained, its presence an ominous shadow in the distance. The old man sat by the window, his cane resting across his lap like a silent reminder of the day's events. He didn't know who was in that car or what they wanted, but he wasn't going to let fear control him. Somewhere in the city, the man in the suit sat in his own car, staring at his phone as messages and updates poured in. The journalist had sent him a draft of the story, and it was powerful, raw, unflinching, and impossible to ignore. But he also knew it was a gamble. As he stared out into the night, the man couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. And when his phone buzzed with a new message, a single, cryptic line from an unknown number, his suspicions were confirmed. It read, "Stop now, or face the consequences." The man in the suit stared at the message on his phone, his pulse quickening. The words were simple but carried an unmistakable threat. Whoever sent it wanted him to know they were watching, that they were capable of silencing him if he didn't back off. For a moment, he felt the weight of his decision bearing down on him. He knew what kind of forces he was up against, powerful people who had no problem using intimidation to protect themselves. But fear wasn't going to stop him. He had made up his mind the moment he saw the elderly man fall to the ground and heard the boy's cries for help. Backing down wasn't an option, not when so many others had faced the same injustice and been ignored. He took a deep breath, typed a quick reply not stopping, and hit send. Whatever happened next, he was ready to face it. Across town, the elderly man shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his gaze locked on the car still parked down the street. It hadn't moved for hours, but the longer it stayed, the more uneasy he became. The streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement, and the silence outside felt heavy, almost oppressive. He tried to convince himself it was nothing, a random car, a harmless coincidence. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching, waiting. He glanced at his grandson, still asleep on the couch, and felt a surge of protectiveness. He had already endured more than his fair share of hardship in life, but this felt different. It wasn't just about him anymore. As the night stretched on, the tension inside the house grew. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of wind against the windows set the old man on edge. He stayed near the front door, his cane within arm's reach, determined to stay alert. Then, just after midnight, the car's headlights suddenly flicked on. The old man froze, his breath catching in his throat as he watched the car roll slowly down the street. But instead of driving away, it stopped directly in front of his house. The engine idled for a moment, and then the driver's door opened. A figure stepped out, silhouetted by the dim light. They didn't approach the house but instead stood by the car, their posture stiff and deliberate. The old man squinted, trying to make out the person's features, but the distance and shadows made it impossible. His heart pounded as he debated what to do. Should he call someone? Confront them? Stay silent and hope they went away? Before he could decide, the figure raised an arm and tossed something toward the house. The object landed with a dull thud on the porch. The old man didn't move for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the object. Finally, he gathered his courage and stepped cautiously toward the door. Peering through the peephole, he saw the figure get back into the car and drive away, the taillights disappearing into the darkness. He opened the door slowly, his hand trembling slightly as he reached down to pick up what had been left behind. It was a small, unmarked envelope, the kind you'd find in any office supply store. His fingers hesitated for a moment before tearing it open. Inside was a single piece of paper with a message written in bold, blocky letters: "Stay quiet or else." The old man's hand shook as he read the words. His mind raced with questions. Who had sent this? Was it the officer trying to cover his tracks, or was someone higher up involved? And more importantly, what did they mean by "or else"? He didn't have time to dwell on it. His grandson stirred on the couch, and he quickly tucked the note into his pocket, not wanting to alarm the boy. But as he sat back down, his thoughts were consumed by the warning. Meanwhile, the man in the suit was busy working with the journalist, gathering every piece of evidence they could find. The video footage had already started making waves online, with comments pouring in from people who were outraged by what they saw. But along with the support came something darker: anonymous messages, veiled threats, and attempts to discredit the story. The journalists received a call from a source who claimed to have inside information about the officer involved. It's not just him, the source said in a hushed tone. There's a whole network protecting guys like him. If you dig too deep, you're going to find yourself in serious trouble. What kind of network? The journalist pressed, his pen poised over his notepad. I can't say much over the phone, the source replied. But let's just say there are people in positions of power who don't want this getting out. They've been covering for each other for years, and they won't hesitate to come after anyone who threatens that. The call ended abruptly, leaving the journalist with more questions than answers. He relayed the information to the man in the suit, who frowned as he listened. If this is as big as they're saying, we need more than just one video, the man said. We need a pattern. Proof that this isn't an isolated incident. The journalist nodded. I'll start digging through old records, complaints, anything I can find. But it's going to take time. Time is the one thing we don't have, the man replied grimly. Back at the old man's house, the night passed uneventfully, but the unease lingered. By morning, the old man decided he couldn't keep what had happened to himself. He reached out to a local community leader he trusted, someone who had a reputation for standing up against injustice. When the leader arrived at the house, the old man showed him the note and explained everything that had happened. The leader's expression darkened as he listened. This isn't just about you, the leader said. Whoever sent this is trying to send a message to everyone who speaks out. We can't let them scare us into silence. The old man nodded, feeling a flicker of hope. For the first time since the incident, he didn't feel entirely alone. But as the leader left the house, his phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. He glanced at the screen and felt a chill run down his spine. The message was short but chilling: "You're next." The stakes had just been raised, and it was clear that whoever was behind this wasn't going to back down without a fight. As the pieces of the puzzle began to come together, the conflict escalated, drawing more people into its orbit. And yet, through all the fear and uncertainty, a sense of determination began to take root. The old man, the man in the suit, the journalist, and the community leader all knew they were up against something bigger than any one of them. But they also knew that change never came without a fight. The question now wasn't whether they could win, but how far they were willing to go to stand up for what was right. And as the forces working against them began to close in, it became clear that the battle was only just beginning. The sun was just beginning to set, casting long shadows across the neighborhood as the old man sat by his window, watching the street below. For days, tension had filled the air, each moment dragging on like an eternity. But tonight felt different. There was a strange stillness, a sense of something imminent. He didn't know what was coming, but he could feel it in his bones. Across town, the man in the suit and the journalist finalized their plan. They had managed to gather a mountain of evidence, additional complaints from other victims, footage from nearby incidents, and even a recorded phone call from an anonymous whistleblower. The story had grown far beyond one officer's actions. It now pointed to a network of corruption that reached higher than anyone had anticipated. The community leader had rallied people together, spreading word of a peaceful march to demand accountability. Crowds were already gathering, their voices echoing through the streets as they chanted for justice. It was a powerful sight, families, young and old, standing shoulder to shoulder, united by a shared purpose. But even amidst the unity, a sense of unease lingered. The old man's grandson, clutching his grandfather's hand tightly, peeked through the window. "Grandpa, why are there so many people outside?" he asked, his voice tinged with curiosity and nervousness. The old man patted his hand gently. "They're here to make things right," he said. "To show that we're not alone." But even as he said the words, his eyes flicked toward the end of the street, where an unmarked car had parked earlier in the day. It hadn't moved since that as night fell. The marchers began making their way toward City Hall, their voices growing louder with each step. But just as they rounded the corner onto the main avenue, chaos erupted. A line of officers in riot gear stood blocking their path, their expressions cold and unyielding. The crowd faltered, murmurs of uncertainty rippling through it. Suddenly, someone in the crowd shouted, "Stay calm! Keep moving!" The leader's voice rose above the noise, urging everyone to remain peaceful. But before the crowd could move forward, a loud crack echoed through the air, the sound of something breaking. Panic spread like wildfire as people scattered, unsure of what had happened. Back at the house, the old man's phone buzzed with a notification. A live stream from the march had begun, and he could see the chaotic scene unfolding. His heart sank as he watched the community leader trying to calm the crowd while officers pushed forward, their batons raised. The man in the suit, who was also watching the stream, felt a surge of anger. "This isn't how it was supposed to go," he muttered, grabbing his phone. He dialed the journalist, who was already on the ground, trying to capture the scene. "I'm here," the journalist said breathlessly. "It's bad. They're not backing down, and the crowd is getting restless." "Get closer," the man in the suit urged. "We need to capture everything. If they think they can silence us, they're wrong." But as the journalist pushed through the crowd, something unexpected happened. A group of marchers broke away from the main crowd and began walking toward the line of officers, their hands raised in a gesture of peace. Among them was a young woman holding a microphone, her voice clear and steady as she spoke. "We're not here to fight," she said. "We're here to be heard." The officers hesitated, their rigid formation faltering for just a moment. It was enough for the journalist to step forward, his camera trained on the scene. He captured every second as the young woman continued to speak, her words resonating with the crowd. But just as it seemed the tension might ease, a commotion erupted at the edge of the crowd. The journalist turned his camera toward the noise, and what he saw made his blood run cold. A man, dressed in plain clothes but clearly trying to blend in, was moving toward the front of the crowd. In his hand was a small device, something metallic that glinted under the streetlights. Before anyone could react, the man activated the device, sending a loud, piercing sound through the air. It was a signal, a deliberate attempt to incite chaos. And it worked. The crowd panicked, surging forward as confusion spread. Officers rushed in, their batons swinging, and the peaceful march descended into chaos. The journalists tried to keep filming, but the crowd was too dense, the panic too overwhelming. Back at the house, the old man watched in horror as the scene unfolded on his screen. His grandson clung to his arm, tears streaming down his face. "Grandpa, what's happening?" the boy asked, his voice trembling. The old man didn't have an answer. All he could do was hold his grandson close, his heart breaking as he watched the chaos unfold. But then, something unexpected happened. As the camera panned across the scene, the old man spotted a familiar face in the crowd. It was the man in the suit, pushing his way toward the front, his expression determined. The man reached the young woman with the microphone and whispered something to her. She nodded, her face resolute, and then turned back to the crowd. "Don't let them scare you," she shouted, her voice cutting through the noise. "This is exactly what they want to divide us, to make us afraid. But we're stronger than that." Her words had an almost magical effect. The crowd began to calm, their fear replaced by a renewed sense of purpose. People linked arms, standing firm even as the officers pushed forward. And then, the final twist came. The journalist, still filming, spotted the man with the device trying to slip away. He followed him, his camera trained on the man's every move. But before the man could disappear, he was stopped not by the crowd, but by another officer. The officer, one of the few who had shown restraint during the chaos, grabbed the man by the arm and pulled him aside. Their exchange was brief but intense, and then the officer did something no one expected. He cuffed the man and led him away. The journalist captured the entire scene, his heart racing as he realized what had just happened. The man with the device wasn't just trying to incite chaos, he was working with someone on the inside. And now, the proof was undeniable. The live stream ended shortly after, but the impact was immediate. Within hours, the footage went viral, sparking outrage across the country. The evidence of corruption, combined with the bravery of those who stood their ground, was enough to force a full-scale investigation. And as the dust settled, the old man sat by his window, watching the sunrise with a sense of quiet relief. For the first time in a long time, he felt hope not just for himself, but for the future his grandson would grow up in. The fight wasn't over, but it was clear that change was finally within reach. And as the world watched, united by the courage of those who refused to stay silent, one thing became certain: the truth could not be silenced. The morning after the chaos, the city awoke to a new kind of energy, one that was both heavy with the weight of what had happened and electric with the promise of what could come next. The footage from the journalist's camera had taken the internet by storm, sparking debates, conversations, and most importantly, action. The undeniable evidence of wrongdoing had reached not just the people of the city but the entire nation. News outlets picked up the story, replaying the moment when the corrupt instigator was arrested by one of his own. The old man sat in his living room with his grandson, the bright glow of the television illuminating their faces. The screen displayed the same images over and over, the crowd standing strong, the young woman raising her voice, and the eventual arrest that turned everything around. His grandson, still holding his hand, looked up at him with wide eyes. "Grandpa, are the bad people gone now?" the boy asked softly, his voice filled with cautious hope. The old man sighed deeply, resting his hand on the boy's shoulder. "Not all of them," he said, his voice steady but tired. "But this is a step in the right direction. When people stand together, they can make change happen. We've seen that now." Across town, the man in the suit sat in a conference room, speaking to reporters. His work over the past few weeks had finally culminated in a moment. He had been waiting for a chance to expose the corruption that had plagued their city for years. The whistleblower who had come forward anonymously had since revealed their identity, and was cooperating with investigators, adding even more weight to the growing case. This isn't just about one officer, the man in the suit said, addressing the cameras. This is about a system that allowed this kind of behavior to go unchecked. It's about accountability and ensuring that this never happens again, not here, not anywhere. The journalist, who had been watching the press conference from the back of the room, felt a mix of pride and exhaustion. He had risked everything to tell this story, to shine a light on the truth, and now it was finally paying off. As he packed up his equipment, he caught the eye of the man in the suit, who gave him a small nod. It was a silent acknowledgement of the role they had both played in bringing the truth to light. Meanwhile, the young woman who had stood at the front of the march was sitting with her family, still processing everything that had happened. She had never imagined that her voice would carry so far, that her words would resonate with so many people. As she scrolled through social media, she saw countless messages of support, people sharing their own stories of injustice and thanking her for standing up. But what struck her the most was a message from someone she didn't know, someone who had watched the live stream from across the country. "Your courage gave me hope," the message read. "Because of you, I'm going to speak out too." Tears welled up in her eyes as she read the words. It wasn't just about what had happened in their city, it was about the ripple effect, the way one act of bravery could inspire others to do the same. The investigation into the department moved swiftly in the days that followed. Officers who had abused their power were suspended, and many faced charges. The man who had tried to incite violence at the march was revealed to have been part of a larger scheme to discredit the protesters, and his arrest led to even more revelations about corruption within the ranks. The officer who had initially attacked the old man was among those who were charged. For the first time, he was forced to face the consequences of his actions, and his trial became a symbol of the city's commitment to justice. The old man, though still recovering from his injuries, was asked to testify. It was a daunting prospect, but he agreed without hesitation. When the day of the trial came, he stood before the courtroom, his voice steady as he recounted what had happened to him. "I was just trying to get home," he said, his gaze fixed on the officer sitting across the room. "I didn't deserve what happened to me, and neither did anyone else who's been hurt by this kind of behavior. But I'm standing here today because I believe we can do better. We have to do better." His words struck a chord with everyone in the room. The officer's defense crumbled under the weight of the evidence, and the verdict was clear. Justice was served, and the message was loud and clear: no one was above the law. In the weeks that followed, the city began to heal. The changes didn't happen overnight, but they were real. New policies were implemented, and community leaders worked closely with local officials to rebuild trust. The march that had ended in chaos became a symbol of resilience, and the people who had participated in it continued to fight for change. The young woman who had spoken out became a prominent voice in the movement, using her platform to advocate for reform and inspire others to take action. The journalist continued his work, determined to keep telling stories that mattered. And the man in the suit, though relieved to see his efforts paying off, knew there was still more to be done. As for the old man, life slowly returned to normal. His injuries healed, and he found solace in the knowledge that his story had played a part in something much bigger. One evening, as he sat on his porch with his grandson, watching the sunset, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in a long time. "Grandpa," the boy said, breaking the silence, "are we safe now?" The old man looked at him, his eyes soft but filled with determination. "Safer than we were," he said. "And as long as we keep standing up for what's right, we'll get safer every day." The boy nodded, a small smile spreading across his face. He didn't fully understand everything that had happened, but he knew one thing for certain: his grandfather was a hero, not just to him but to everyone who had heard his story. And so, as the city moved forward, the memory of what had happened became a reminder of what was possible when people stood together. It wasn't just a victory for justice, it was a testament to the power of courage, truth, and unity. The old man, the young woman, the journalist, and the man in the suit had all played their part, but the real heroes were the people who refused to stay silent. They had shown that even in the face of adversity, change was possible. And though the road ahead would still have its challenges, they knew they were walking it together, stronger than ever before. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the city in a warm, golden glow, the old man smiled. It wasn't just the end of one chapter, it was the beginning of something new, something better. And that, he thought, was a future worth fighting for.